Hello, Dr. S. Wow, it looks like you really did recreate the talking to a wall experience. Well, I guess that's what I'm looking for right now. It's not that, anything's going wrong. Um, it's just I need to talk and, share some thoughts, organize them for myself. I've been for 6 months on a bit of a sabbatical to, figure out what I want to do next in this world. And part of it is figure out my answer to the question of what is bipolar disorder and do I have it? And my answer is I have bipolar. I don't think I have disorder. And I think understanding my experience, understanding from others' experiences has been something I've wanted to do. And I think always through this, someone needs to find their form of therapy. And one of the things I struggle with in life is I can never ask for help. There's a theory of grief. I learned about this when I was dealing with my mother's cancer diagnosis, and eventually we never had certainty of when she'd pass away. We had a lot of years together, but when she did pass away, the idea is like when some really like awful moment happens, there's a person in the center of that grief story. And with my mother's passing, I knew it would be my dad, and the next wave would have me and my brother and my mother's sister and others, maybe even my mother's sisters in that same center circle. But regardless, there was these sort of rings of people, and you console inwards and you throw grief outwards to those who are further from the challenge and know how to deal with that. And why talking to a wall might be the answer for me right now is that I think when I'm sometimes in my most introspective, I'm also at my most empathetic. And it's almost like, regardless of the tragedy, if it's something in my life, if it's an issue with the world, everyone is inside me in the circle of grief. And what I want to do is absorb that grief and throw it out into the void, into the vastness of space we will never get to. Um, and so maybe that's the therapy for me. But, there are times in my life where I've needed to just speak into the void, and there are times I want to be listening from the void for messages that might help. And you don't always find those. And maybe that's where knowing my first language of communication is written, and even getting to like these spoken words. Like most people actually communicate through words. I guess I do it through written words and not spoken words. Like I find visual appearance of emotion and rates of speech and other stuff, not the perfect signals of someone's health, but I guess I've learned sometimes that in expressing the most like true and honest things, sometimes these words help. And for sure, I've always been a believer of like making notes in certain days or dates or times of the things you thought. Like memory is highly fallible, and so like I go back and read like the message I sent to an ex-girlfriend 2 days after my mother's death, and learn so much about myself from going back to it. And in different stages, maybe I was even trying to, when I was in one of my more hypomanic modes, not knowing if I crossed any line from just poor mental health into mental illness. I just wanted a record of those things. I mean, there's some cynical slash ahead of me kind of game of the world of saying the reason for 5+ years I recorded solving videos of puzzles on Grandmaster Puzzles, saying today we're here to talk through I use the same sentence at the start and the same concept of a sentence at the end. So if there was actually anything that like a machine could learn from just listening to the intonation of my voice when I wasn't trying to do extra things in it, to say, is there a metric of Thomas's mental health from his speech? Maybe it's there. Like, I don't know. Like those videos are out there, but the thing is, I'm doing well, but I'm still like this year searching for a bigger part of my life mission. And in the same way I got tired at some stage of talking all the time about my mental health, well, not sorry, about Sudoku to everyone that meets me on the street. It's part of my story, and bipolar is part of my story. And right now, like the reason I wanted this session today is this first week of July, we've had a big launch, and I don't mean the Facebook, Twitter thing. Like, puzzles are sometimes my bridge back to getting into science and into life. And like Grandmaster Puzzles had a launch, and we had a few hundred people sign up, not 70 million. We had a few hundred people. We don't have Instagram's reach, but I've had some nights with less sleep, and like I'm walking more. And so it's not that I'm anywhere near the extremes of my worst mental health, but some of the things, the metrics I know to watch for, have started again. And so it's useful to be tracking, both because I'm fearless enough to start to speak more and kind of bring some things out. But I've been working on a project. I want to tell the story of Sudoku, and in the videos that most people in this YouTube channel should be watching, that's what I'm going to be doing. But this is a series for me, and maybe for others who'd listen, but it's for me. because there's going to be a time a year from now and 5 years from now and 10 years from now, like I'm the audience for whatever these words were as I'm further along in my life journey. And so maybe since, I don't know, Dr. S, what your real specialty is, like, why don't I just get started with telling you, like, in my professional way, like my story from the start. And obviously, this isn't a job interview, but I'm using my slides from a job interview because that's sometimes a slightly easier way to go about these things. Why is my community afraid or scared for me? Like, I have the look of a perfect resume to be doing tons of things with my life. Why don't I want a job? It's not that I'm searching for a job and can't find it. And like, I kind of know the mission I want to do in life. At least I know a lot of the traits of the mission, but I'm still trying to find a way to achieve it. And so I think that sort of self-doubt, or at least the searching mode, you sort of go between doing modes and searching modes. Like, that's the tough thing. But I distill my life to 3 kinds of traits. These are my super skills. I'm a problem solver. How the world knows me as a problem solver is I can do things like solve Sudoku or logic puzzles or word puzzles or puzzle hunts or even other things in different ways. Like, puzzles are thinking about the constraints of life or an arbitrary situation, working through their sticking points, finding metrics for success, gauging your progress, knowing when you're stuck, changing approaches when you're stuck. Like, Sudoku is an awesome puzzle for data science because there are, like, maybe 5, 10, 15 heuristics around it, but you can measure for a different solver what they're stronger at and weaker at. And I at least, like, in training for the puzzle myself, learned to use it in certain ways by just permuting the digits of a grid and solving the same grid again in the future, but being double blinded. I can run a double blind experiment in a Sudoku puzzle. And that's something I want to talk about eventually, and it's not important for today. But anyway, problem solving is one of the first traits I talk about. The second is really the mission in life. And I guess at some stage, because problem solving is the first axis of that mission, without it, I can't do anything more. At least if I can't figure out who are the people who can help solve the problems I want to solve with them. Like, I can't get back into science, but it's also why it's kind of weird to always answer the question, what percentage of a time in a week of my life should I spend on puzzles? Like, this always has felt since my 20s to really be my goal. And why does it feel like, oh, it's not because of the success on the slide. I mean, the success is here on the slide. There's a story I didn't know how to really tell when I was in my 20s, in part because I couldn't tell in my 20s. The second year I was in graduate school, my mother got a diagnosis of stage 4 breast cancer. And when she first got that diagnosis, we didn't have any sense if she'd live that year, if she'd even see my brother's wedding. I was many years out from graduating. Like, the abilities of tumor markers to tell anything for her life, to kind of like improve her ability to kind of like go through that life, just wasn't there. She was blessed to like respond to estrogen receptor therapies, and we had 14 years together. And at some stage, like, the end was just as shocking as the start because it was so sudden when we felt we had time together. But that story that for someone who is so dear and close to the center of my life, to sort of see someone who is now like not feeling as free to live their life as a whole every day because there weren't the biomarkers to kind of know what was coming. Like, the weird thing in the last year and a half of my life is like having trends of bipolar, where in some people it can lead to mental illness. Like, I want the same biomarkers to know if I can be as fearless and creative and sometimes push myself as far as I want to go. But it's we may have the treatments, we don't know sort of the tools and the places to use them. And so, like, the interesting story for me is I was maybe on a path to becoming a professor. I was still kind of playing around. I was doing chemistry at Harvard. I was playing around different thought spaces. I came to Stanford, came close to the School of Medicine, working at the School of Bioengineering, to try to at least answer the question, could I do something, anything, to help someone who has a condition in their life that may like impair their ability to lead a good life, kind of get more from it. And I was blessed after 2-3 years of not having a project that was being fruitful to get introduced to this project, which was the question of like, if someone is getting a new transplant of a heart, of a lung, of a kidney in their life, there's a ton of care that happens after that operation, in part because you have to be carefully monitoring how much of drugs you give to that person so that their immune system doesn't reject that organ, but at the same time not give them so many immunosuppressive drugs that like they can't fight off other things. And so the concept we had, where the standard of care was you'd go back to your surgical center and they'd come through your jugular vein and they'd take out pieces of your heart and sort of see if immune cells were there, and if there was inflammation, we said, could we just take a blood sample and look for donor-derived DNA? If you get someone else's heart, you get someone else's genome in those cells. And so whether you view this as an obvious idea or not, we felt that we could measure with some precision the amount of a healthy transplanted person as well as a person who's starting to undergo acute cellular rejection. And the graph on the left is someone that I've labeled here as healthy. They may actually be over immunosuppressed. The graph on the right is someone who had a biopsy at every single time point shown there. You see the rise over time of points that are getting up to as much as 4% of all the DNA in their blood is coming from their heart. And finally, at month 18, the biopsy says they have rejection. They get treated with steroids. They get better. They have a few more, they continue to sort of have life, but the heart was injured during that time, and it's going to lengthen the second lease they got in their life from having that operation. And so to sort of start with an approach to this technology, to be a patent inventor at Stanford for it, to go to a startup company as its chief scientist, Immumetrics, to kind of make it happen. And the Immumetrics story is complex. It's not for today, Dr. S, but it's for someday. Eventually, it got acquired by CareDx, and they've commercialized this and brought transplant solutions for heart and lung and kidney, using cell-free DNA kidney as the main market in many places. And other companies have followed, and there have been patent suits, and like the patents behind this are currently in some state being appealed to the Supreme Court. So like if and when, this story has its next chapter, it's not been where my science has been, but it connects back to that mission from my mother's story, from tracking her cancer to people who do get a new heart, to me with my mental health. Can we actually monitor people throughout their lives, have a sense of when things could be changing, and do something for them? Like that's the foundation of my goal. And everywhere else in science, I've been trying to amplify that further. It starts by leading small teams, and a typical thing is you start to lead larger teams. And so I went to a crazy place like Verily. At the time it was called Google Life Science. Like my puzzle life had me always wearing a Google Puzzle Championships jacket around. And so my graduate advisor said, go work for Google. And it didn't make sense at the time. And then my postdoctoral advisor said, go work for Google. And it didn't make sense at the time. Eventually I got to work for Google. And one of the things I did while there was to partner with the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Biogen and other people looking at multiple sclerosis, which is a disease of the immune system and of the brain. The immune system is attacking neural cells. It's not the same as, maybe the mental illness of schizophrenia or something else, but you have to ask questions like this. If you lose part of the brain here, is it impacting how you walk or how you have bladder control or how you think and see? And it's very hard to image and sense brain cells as they die, but could we do things like watch how people are walking and moving and sleeping, and use those to have better metrics of their health? And we did studies. This is the one that got published. Again, I'm not trying to do a science talk here, but we basically had people in the clinic do some of the same tests that happen when a doctor visits with a patient once or twice a year. Walk 25 feet down the hall, turn around, walk 25 feet back. They're kind of checking for balance and gait and how fast they swing during the turn of arms. And you can see things like the time it takes for them to do some of these actions, like how much they turn, they correlate with clinical scores. We did other things, like if you're going to go to Google, of course, you're going to be exploring machine learning. So we did some of that. I mean, the lessons are you have to have the right data and the right size, and I think there's more hype around machine learning and health science than there's kind of delivery. But I think the right solutions are going to come about there, and I'm very optimistic for these potentials. The and my mother passed away during this time, and I was also running into the typical corporate limits of like how much you can do in certain places. I love the exposure to people like, Rob Califf, Tom Insel, like where I had always been curious about my mental health through my life because I knew I wasn't neurotypical in all respects. To see sort of the programs that were starting there to like try to measure and monitor. We were doing it from a physiometric sense. They were trying to do it from a cognitive and attribution of speech or text messages or social network kinds of modes. It wasn't a place I was able to sort of define my next role at that time, and so I jumped to a place, Adaptive, where I'd been before, and I actually started there the week the COVID pandemic was hitting the U.S. And it had already been sort of a place of fear for some time, but it was hitting us there. It was a project that's going to have me leading now a team of 30 to 50 people, 30 directly, like a research org, wet lab, dry lab. I'm going to say is computational focus and non-computational focus. I view them all as scientists, like as long as you can think and ask questions the right way. I think it's helpful to have all those perspectives. And we had a broad team at Microsoft Research working on it too. And some form of my first week on that job was sending my whole team home to do remote work for some amount of time and figure out how to get the lab folks to be able to do some stuff. A month in, we, as a whole company, organized a set of studies to bring in samples from individuals with COVID-19. And we had our prior experience of controls, people before COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2 specifically, uh, was out there to kind of assess the immune system. We started to actually build new solutions. Like our mission during COVID wasn't just to kind of, shelter and protect ourselves. Our mission was to bring like almost everyone in science, like even my brother who's an organic chemist never works around virology. So like, can I make molecules that might help with things like COVID? The whole science community rallied together. And this was the way we rallied together. We made the first T-cell based test to tell if people had had an immune response against proteins from the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And we did this by taking COVID patients after infection. We took controls, they're orange and blue. We did some very basic statistics in the middle. You could label it machine learning, but it's pretty much linear regression. And you get a result like in this lower right plot. Like orange is not blue. And there is a blue point here, but we think that's someone who didn't have a clinical label of exposure. They may have been an asymptomatic patient. I think when we looked at their antibody levels, they'd had a B cell response against this thing too. But this was like the potential in the disease area to do some new science. And we did some really impressive science at Adaptive. We did some studies. There's a population in Padua, Italy that had everyone in the town in the early days, this is more in February of 2020, have blood samples taken for those who consented. It was about 2/3 of the population. We looked at those who were asymptomatic, who were more symptomatic, who were hospitalized. You see like the levels of these responses changed. This study had follow-up like 9-15 months after this time, including when the first vaccines were introduced. And the vaccines are against spike protein, a specific external protein of SARS-CoV-2. And we had T-cell responses against more proteins than that. And so we could split apart like the response to spike. If you get vaccinated, your spike signal goes up. Look at that sort of orange trace. If it's against something else, it's unchanged. Basically, the initial immune response is tapered some and it stays stable. This is your long-term immunity. These cells will come back if SARS-CoV-2 comes back. It's okay that you have fewer of them. They're there for the next time. But yeah, like it was kind of like taking this mission of doing precision medicine and saying, could we do it for settings in immunity? And it made sense as interviewing for jobs to kind of keep thinking in this mode. Like I went through, Adaptive went through a workforce reduction situation, and that led to me having some pretty, as I said, I was internalizing a lot of the grief myself and not sort of outletting it in helpful ways. And in different modes, sort of took a leave of absence for mental health reasons. Eventually, just left Adaptive, but not with a lot of regrets, given the potential and still the potential for Adaptive to do great science. And still with this mission of multi-omics, precision medicine, interviewed at different places. These biomarkers are rarely highly sensitive and specific, so they won't work alone, but most people doing multi-omics throw everything into one bin and hope they can do intelligent science. We need hypothesis-directed machine learning here, and my goal, said simply, simple diagnosis to differential diagnosis. A good biomarker like creatinine, and this has been used for many years, will say there's something wrong with your kidney. It won't necessarily say like a virus is affecting it or the immune cells are affecting it or anything else, but with some additional layers on top, you can get to disease mechanism. And that's where it's even a lesson back from my first transplantation work. I first felt I was done when I had a test with our Stanford colleagues that could just measure the heart was being injured, but then I learned the patient experience better. And the story for me at Stanford was that we could start to do early research to try to separate rejection from infection. This is still far from the clinic, but this is, again, the potential here. Like I said, the way our test worked was we could look in the blood for donor-derived DNA, human DNA that looks like it's coming from a heart that's been transplanted to someone who otherwise has different DNA in a lot of positions. We look at their SNPs, like a few 100,000 spots in their genome that's really different. Having high amounts of DNA, we'd say, like, you have injury, go get other tests, come back to your doctor. Low, we'd say you're healthy. And we discard a lot of other reads. And we came back with a new idea, which is, well, there are other reads in the bloodstream too, like cytomegalovirus. That's a important virus that most of the time we're dealing with, and it reactivates in transplant patients. You actually like search for antibodies against it before you do matching of these organs. So, stories like that, or lung transplantation, much, much, much harder setting than the heart. And again, it's a place where a patient comes back to the clinic, they have issues with their breathing, or they have, essentially like impacted respirometry, they have, other symptoms, pain, uh, you can't tell which of the two it is, and you treat them in different ways. If we think you have Pseudomonas, like a bacterial infection, we need to give you antibiotics stat. And if your immune system is destroying the lung, antibiotics aren't going to do anything to it. But if you start to taper with the immune system is fighting off those antibiotics. And so, the standard of care at the time, and still I think mostly today, is to treat for the infection first because it's the more frequent one. And then if that doesn't clear things up, switch to the other side, and there'll be confirmatory tests and things. But we started to say our assay could look at both, and could we do more with that? And so some of the work at Stanford, this was like after I left, and the work's continued by others. And again, some of the complexities, like my names aren't on all these papers, and it doesn't matter if they are. But again, like this was the potential and possibility of the science in front of me. And so you can see that like there's so much I have that I want to do. And so like, why am I not doing any of it? And I've talked about cancer as a disease of interest. I've talked about the autoimmune system as an area of interest. Like at the start of this year, the most professional and clean way, the LinkedIn way of saying I went about this is I went on sabbatical. And the LinkedIn way is fine. Like for most of the people who know me, that's fine, and I don't have to say more. Like for those who know a little more about me, like, and one was actually a colleague like at Freenome where I was working when I had a very stressful January. Someone from the Pittsburgh area who's like a partner in the space, and we were talking about the different sort of things that matter to us and a lot of our goals and life and in general. And she's telling a story about a family member who herself like is dealing with things like depression in her life, and maybe had moments of suicidal thoughts or other sort of issues, and someone obviously like this person deeply cared for. And I said something like, I rarely start my first conversation with a new team member by saying like I at least identify as non-neurotypical. I have issues with bipolar. Sometimes you'll probably recognize times I'm like overexcited or talk over people versus times I'm more a listener, and it's tied to it's part of what I consider my normal biology, whether a doctor will call it normal biology or not. But I said, like, I have that goal in 30 some years to have mental markers. Not that I view myself as ill, but I think there's something I wanted to learn about myself to maybe then learn how to like learn through others, like those who I've now, since I've been in the mental health system, I've been hospitalized twice. I've seen people with more severe, and it's really not like I feel blessed. Like I consider my bipolar state my superpower and my super weakness. I'm by far my most creative, by far, during moments where I'm more restless and not sleeping well. And I don't want to be trite and say it feels like the Bruce Banner Hulk situation, but it sort of does. Like there are moments I can be a staid, reserved, calm, focused, brilliant scientist, but not have that same creativity and connection of ideas. And there are other moments that can be caused by excitement. They're more often, at least in the job situation, caused by stress. So they're almost exactly the kind of rage version of the Hulk coming out, where now like my body's physiology is different. Like I don't sleep as much. It starts a little bit. Like it started a little bit this last week. I'm not at the stage where I don't need any sleep, and that's most often the time I now am trying to make sure I'm taking a medication or two. But it's like I'm almost in a biological evolutionary state of fight or flight, but where my body is able to compensate it for some amount of time. And part of that's a more active brain, a more active endocrine system. It's definitely able to be connecting thoughts, having new thoughts, writing them down in places. Like it's been interesting. One of the things I've done in the sabbatical is to try to read more and think more and connect with others. And two sort of helpful voices. One, Carl Deiseroff, he's a professor at Stanford. I view him as doing really great research. I never directly talked to him. I've listened to some of his lectures, but I read his book and listened to one of his podcasts with Lex Friedman. And I think he helped me, at least in the definition I needed, of saying like it's okay to relax that term disorder and bipolar disorder. Like if anything, I might be bipolar disorder too, but that is not impacting my ability to do work, but it is something I have to manage in my life. Like that's saying it's a trait of my brain, and it's interesting for me at least that it's a trait of my brain, but I don't need to think of it as debilitating necessarily, but I should be cautious and careful, and use my network or use places like you, Dr. S, or anything else to kind of like do the right thing here. And so as I say, like where I'm at is is still thinking a lot about the why, the where, and the when of mental illness being part of like the research I do in my life, not just a trait where I want to write puzzles because I know other people who struggle can get relief from puzzles. I view Sudoku as much as a drug as I view Sudoku as a thing that teaches people to think intelligently. And for different people, it's one or the other. Like I got into Sudoku when I was dealing with my mother's diagnosis news, losing a girlfriend. Like it was a copacetic, and I used it for dopaminergic response to the best of my understanding, as well as at the time just getting really, really fast at it. I didn't recognize when I started it was going to be that. But like to me, like my life story in Sudoku is part of my mental health story. And puzzles are, I think, maybe a better thing than like drugs or alcohol. And maybe in the future we'll have more copacetics of the form of a Sudoku, but it won't be a Sudoku for everyone. But like, is making puzzles more part of my life a way to answer this question of like how to like really impact mental illness? It's just like the biomarker story, that story. Like the question that Pittsburgh colleague asked me was why 30 years from now? And this was during a rough week when like I was losing power in my home. I had rain coming and we were at the JP Morgan conference talking all these things. And like the focus was cancer, 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 cancer. And like I was at a company who's going to, I hope, and there are other companies working in the same way, I hope have some impact in how the diagnosis and monitoring of cancer changes with Freedom's work. But working on cancer is on the far other end of the spectrum as working on the brain and working on things like schizophrenia, depression, bipolar. Um, and so like one of the things I do when I get these, I write a lot. Like my first language is just lots of written words, and sometimes I send them to people. I often will like write a thing and send it to someone I love, who I also know loves me back and understands me back. And then over time, like I've learned to share a little broader. So like one of the first signs is like, oh, my network reaching out is I like copied a letter I wrote to the CEO of Adaptive Biotechnologies, one of a pair of brothers who are like really great leaders there, just describing like I've been impacted by something that happened. Like, let me sort of jump to the other thing. Like the same day was like, me releasing a video that if there was a trigger besides the conversation about why is mental illness not 30 years out, but like today and what to think about, like the company that had formed a lot of my thoughts on what I want to do next had just laid off 15% of its staff, and a few of the team members I'd worked with, they were suddenly texting me about where's their next job or other things. Everyone's first response in grief is to jump too fast to solution finding and not just taking some time off. And so like I guess I definitely was like planning through this video some ideas, but I wanted to myself come back to. I wanted to capture for myself and for my friends like a 45-minute kind of story, and maybe this is a 50-minute story. Dr. S of what I'm trying to do here, but like I took some time off. I was consciously probably going to leave my job. I hadn't yet made that decision, but I drove down to the South California. Like the time in 2022, I went off the grid for a bit, and then people started to get worried. Like I started to have a Twitter storm. And one of the fun things is like even in 2022, I don't know that I've ever crossed a line of mania. I've not watched the YouTube video that was consciously released, but in a March 13th, 2023 headspace state, or March 14th was on Pi Day, March 14th, 2023 headspace. I've definitely read the Twitter threads I wrote the following day, and they're fully cogent. They're me almost in a performative style, writing notes for my future self about like life philosophy and other things I'm thinking about. And so I've just gone through a great talk about my scientific mission. This is the start of my Twitter thread. I want to facilitate the early detection and prevention of disease and empower people everywhere to live their best possible life. Sounds like my life mission. Do you know that that is 100% the way Theranos described their life mission? One of the fraudulent companies of our day and era. And it was weird, like when I worked at Verily was a little bit secretive about the work. But we were like put in a Theranos box, even though we were doing awesome, incredible, and important science. Like we were led by Andy Conrad, an established and important scientist. And so again, like anywhere you look, anywhere you want to look, it's not if their slides say multiomics or if they're doing machine learning or if their goal is to facilitate the early detection. 100 companies have the mission statement at this top here of this like Twitter storm. Theranos was obvious it wasn't doing stuff right. Verily was obvious too. And I think Freenome, for those who are watching, like all companies have their struggles on different sides of this equation, but like some part of the things in my mind, like Freenome is curious for me, like going to work for a company after I had my first mental health kind of and hospitalization. I went to Freenome as an experiment, and it was even kind of weird, but I wrote this in my letter to to Mike Nolan, the CEO of, of Freenome, like I wasn't sure Freenome was going to be the place for me. Like if I'm actually being like fully honest for this, but I knew it was trying to do the same kind of research, maybe not in the disease area of my most interest. And I felt I wasn't sure I could like work a full-time job in a startup if stress is one of the triggers I have for like going into a more hypomanic manic state. Like watch out for your triggers is the first thing they'll say. Psychiatrists will say, they'll also say stay on your drugs. That's a different conversation, but at least like watch out for your like being in a job may not be the most healthy thing for me to do. Maybe consulting is a healthy thing for me to do, but anyway, Freenome for me is an experiment, and I learned a lot from the experiment, but I'd sort of run its course after 6 months, and even if Freenome's a good place for others, it wasn't the place for me. But even around science, and this is like, again, now coming back to being trite, Thanos is a hero discuss. Like, I don't think there are a lot of evil people in this world, but I think there are people who have like visions for themselves that can cause evil, or there are people who aren't like watching out for themselves. Like, I can do great things in life, and I can also be reckless at times in my life, including when I might be on an extreme mental health. And I think that's like the kind of like Thanos, at least to take the story too short, like had lost people he loved because his planet overpopulated. And so he said, I need to solve a problem in this world. And he chose a very curious way, basically aggregate power with the metaphors of infinity stones to be the aggregation of such power. You can view that as wealth. You can view that as a network of people, like however you want to extend the metaphor from the comics, from magical objects to realistic things that we can perceive in our life, like means of communication, means of power, charisma, creativity. Like eventually you have them all and boom, you can get stuff done. Boom. It's not literally a snap, but in the lifespan of the universe and like this like moment in our life, it's like a snap. And so like anyway, like I know this is a mess. I'm sorry. We'll do this better in the future so that, you know, if some of the data is like important here, this isn't on Twitter anymore because I don't have the account there. I have all these tweets and I'm gonna like share them elsewhere. But like that fourth tweet in this long chain on January 12th was your thinking needs an ER. ER are the missing letters from Theranos and Thanos. That's just 2 letters. I still want Twitter 2.0 and conversations worth 144,000 words. Well, that's like the start of my thread from March 15th when people were writing me and wondering if a bot had taken over my channel and this was a deep fake. This was me writing my philosophy of life down, maybe just for myself, but because I never used this channel, people certainly knew something was up. And they, like, the second one is probably the right place to start with. Communicate to people to their individual language in this exact moment. Twitter 1.0 is 144 characters in Japanese. It's better in English, but communication was garbage. Communicating ideas and pictures, like, this is not my mode of communication, but if there's anything through like these Thomas Snyder / mental health focused YouTube videos that I hope to eventually get, I got 17 minutes at least for this session, but to get across is that there's something more here that's part of my life too. It's not me keeping mental health my own story. I said, like, why did I not know how to tell my mother's story about cancer until recently? Well, I also wasn't supposed to tell my mother's story about cancer until recently. Like she revealed to maybe only the closest family members in the world that she had it because she didn't want to be viewed as someone with cancer. She was frightened to death of losing her hair from chemotherapy. And so where I was like, I revealed it to my best friend and sort of a person I was dating at the time who's still like honestly like my second best friend, and somebody who gets sometimes these longer messages, at least before I started to share them in different ways. Like it's a very honest practice of people with disease that they don't want to always talk about it because of the stigma that gets attached around it. Like I guess I don't care if a future job does or does not like give me some like bipolar disorder test when I take the job, but I think it's important for people to know I have it because like it's both where it can help them because they'll have people who don't know how to speak up in their teams, but it's also where they need to watch out for me. Like and I'm not saying any workplace I've been has been bad at this, but I feel it's like the ways we interrelate as people and the ways we watch out for these things, like we put stigmas in almost every disease, and there's a lot of like good intended people out in this world. There are more Thanoses maybe in how we perceive people when they're actually more heroes. But they're living their own life challenges. They have their own goals. They're trying to accomplish them in their ways. They may or may not know how to ask for help. I don't know how to ask for help. And the few times I even like when I felt I did need like a psychiatrist, like I'd get responses on web forms that like they're overbooked and 6 weeks later from now I could maybe get an appointment. And I'm not someone who's going to pick up the phone and call. Like hearing is my worst sense, and I don't like talking on phones. One of the things when I started the sabbatical is I decided to not really have to talk on a phone this year. And so like, yeah, I've been lost to the mental health care system except for this like ability to talk to a wall that I've set up for myself. And this is good therapy for me, and I'm doing fine. But like part of the conversation I want to have is not about Sudoku sometimes, and that's maybe the conversation I want to sometimes have, at least with you, while I learn the language to tell it to others. Because I found and find the Verily Riff video profound. Like until this last week, the last time I was in a hypomanic mode was basically an initial spark. I was already kind of like agitated, but it was a spark that was started, and kind of had several days of really interesting percolation. Like when I got this news, and suddenly made a decision. It was quick. Like sometimes you want to wait for a state and a date and like test things. And I have some other stuff like with GM puzzles, we've got states and dates for things you want to watch out for. But for me, like the first order take of like that video was creativity and love output during a time of stress. It's not a patient going through disorder. Like my mode of speech was faster. Like, you know, I definitely get more visionary at some stage. Like I think of things in the sense of zero and infinity, and when I'm depressed, I empathize most with zero. I need to find the things in life that pull me back to one. And when I'm manic or hypomanic, I'll always use the term hypomanic. It doesn't matter. I'm above my normal axis, and my normal axis is an average of my life, and maybe one day in my life I've ever been at that actual point. I'm like usually a little on either side, never an extreme if I can deal with it. But I look back at like that video and see like again like I want to know that Thomas who can like within like a day of having like some of the most miserable news he's experienced, write out and write down like a different life philosophy, at least a different kind of goal that he wants to work with. And I'm not saying this is profound to everyone. The first lesson I try to teach my scientific team when they read a paper, and I don't have a team right now, but like when I, consult in science, is that you can be excited by the new thing. One of the first things you should ask is like, who is it new or profound or important to? Is it to you because you've just not like known the field before? Is it profound to an expert in the field? I don't know that like the life philosophy I put in the Verily video is profound to many other folks, but it's something that this year at least I'm going back to as well as other things I've done, because it's helping me try to answer some important questions about what I want to be doing next. Maybe not yet the how. I think you sometimes need to stage the questions, but like here are some of the slides from that like talk, and these slides are maybe a better video of like sort of words to come back to than other things I put out there. I don't like to think in limits. You shouldn't either. Naming something puts a limit on it. Go to the ends of the earth for you. Suggest one didn't learn from Larry Spurs the earth is round. There aren't ends to the earth. I mean, they're figurative, maybe not literal ends, like going to the top of Mount Everest. Like it's hard to get back from there. Like I don't go to extremes with this. I like to think in job titles, like, and this is something about like corporate America. And again, I was responding to a layoff of friends at a company I used to work at, like not actively working at, but there are lots of things around it. It's like having a job title and a list of all the things you should do sort of puts a ceiling on what you're going to ever achieve, because you're going to do those things. But those ceilings may limit you by privilege, by politics, by gender, by all sorts of obvious and non-obvious metrics. I mean, I look like a person of privilege, and I am a person of privilege, and that privilege includes my intelligence, but that you don't get until I start talking. And one of my privileges is being blessed by sometimes having a bipolar brain. That's how I'd say it. But one of my super weaknesses is I have a bipolar brain. Anyway, like one of the things in that video, because again I was dealing, it's like, am I going at the right approach if even cancer is a disease to look at? Like cancer in many cases can be limited by better changes in lifestyle, and certainly by removing things like environmental pollutants and other things from our lives. Certainly I think removing stress from our lives as a whole might be a better way to be healthier, not just in the sense of cancer and other things. And so that space of like a really extreme thought of like, and I don't want to relive this video, I did it better then, but that's why I go back to things, is get this sort of feeling of ideas. Like you can cure cancer in mice easily, but a mouse in a lab is a pretty hermetic setting. without a lot of variables that are us going through our daily lives. Like my daily life recently has had like my dad call me because his internet doesn't work, and then the cable company came to fix his internet. And then they did that, but they didn't like tell him how, in a way he would understand. Again, he's old. How to like have that across his iPad and his other devices. I mean, he's never going to see this video, even though he knows about YouTube. He doesn't follow these things. But like, I've had to manage care for a senior person. At the same time, I'm launching a small scale subscription service to people who love puzzles. At the same stage, I'm in the middle of a sabbatical and trying to think about my mental health. But I also know I need to start talking about it. And I want to talk, at least right now, to a blank wall, at least as a metaphor of a blank wall, because I just need to put some stuff out there. And if I'm the main audience, that's fine. But if anyone else wants to listen, if even 1 minute of these 50 minutes has something important for them in their lives, that's the whole 50 minutes were well spent then. A 2% change in someone's life is a great use of that time. Like if we could even make the world 1% better next year, the compounding of that in the next 10 years probably recovers from us from all of what COVID has caused, the war in Ukraine has caused, what other things have caused. And I got to kind of this sort of space, like my sentence for this year, the thing I'm thinking about is, why do I consider my normal biological state my superpower, my super weakness? And I've highlighted 2 words in the Microsoft theme style of this deck, because I think whenever you ask a question, you need to come back to defining your question and defining the words. And the word my matters, but I'm starting with the word my. Eventually I want to remove my, and maybe the word normal doesn't matter, but I'm starting by at least thinking about times in my life when I have a higher output of what I type or think or write down. And, you know, there's a podcast that was Jeff Hinton describing this. Jeff Hinton's viewed as a visionary person in artificial intelligence research. He started by actually more exploring psychology and the brain, but thinking about the human brain, then think about it in the in silico senses. That's like he say he will go through these waves of having like new thoughts or more thoughts, and that may be when he's more in the manic side of things, and then he'll recognize a lot of these thoughts were bad. He'll go through a creative mode and then a pruning mode. And I think like I'm starting to see things like that in my life, and I'm learning by just listening. And so like that's where I'm at. And I don't actually think the Verily Riff video is that profound. Like some of these thoughts are in the philosophies I've read through my life. They're maybe repackaged in my words. Like there aren't many original thoughts in this world, but there's at least a sense of, you know, people to be thinking. And so I want to give, for those who are worried, not just this blank wall, like a sense that I'm doing fine. I don't have answers. Life won't always bring answers, but I set some staged goals for myself. And the first was at least to focus on wellness and pause caring about the what I was doing in my life. And I made a conscious decision. I'm going to stick with this decision. In part, I don't have an active psychiatrist who's going to prescribe me anything, but I'm not on lithium, which probably be the starting thing for some of my traits. But there are other ways to manage your health than just taking pharmaceuticals. And pharmaceuticals have great impact. I'm a chemist. Like it's part of my scientific work here to kind of be like, you know, doing pharmaceuticals in some way. Like I'm not throwing chemistry under the bus. I'm actually encouraging it. But like diet and exercise, and like for me, for sure, like when my sleep gets impacted as bad, like I have metrics to watch. I have friends who watch for these metrics. Here's my physical health story from last November to now. Like here's a period where I started to enter hypomanic high stress state, and I was like walking more, sleeping less, and my weight did go down like 5 pounds like through the start of this year. And I had a hospitalization through this period. You see no Fitbit data after I like drove down to Southern California and couldn't get to sleep. Like eventually I got on a 5150 again, an involuntary commitment again. I didn't need it really, but I at least needed sleep. So it was good that I got some of that through it. But some of the antipsychotic and other meds, they always cause me to like overindulge. I can't control my eating on them. And that's like, that itself makes me miserable. And then like the drugs don't necessarily do much because it's just trying to get me back to a less hypomanic state. And that's I want to sometimes be there. I want to sometimes feel creative. I also sometimes want to be able to be focused and calm and like the Bruce Banner, not the Hulk, but like through exercise every single day. Like some days I couldn't do anything more than just, you know, do a morning exercise and then just like sit. Didn't sort of have the mood to be creative or write a puzzle or like read a book. Some days I did read books, but like I lost 20 pounds in the last 6 months. Q2, like I started to do improvements around my living situation. I hate making phone calls. I said that. I at least finally decided I will like have this window fixed. I will like figure out how to get my roof replaced. I will put a heat pump into this house so that I can have cooler air sometimes in the summer when climate change is going to cause issues. And so that was adding some stress back into my life, but it was adding at least solutions, at least, at some stage going to see, some of these things resolved was a good thing for me. And it got me to where I want to continue thinking deeply. And again, through reading, I talked about like, Karl Diceroff, I talked about Jeff Hinton, I talked about some other, it'll be interesting to eventually like share my book list and other thoughts somewhere. Like it doesn't matter for today. Like today's just trying to introduce a status check. But I've hit Q3 and Q3 was turning on. And again, with the comfort I was ready to turn on, another stage of activity and re-engagement. And to be clear, just re-engaging in puzzles I don't think is my end mission. But this last week has had a ton of activity there, and it's had some of the kind of traits of like, I've had only like 3 or 4 hours of sleep the last 3 nights. I'll wake up at 3:30 and either go in a Discord and start to like talk about better puzzle design, or I'll take a walk or anything else. Like I'll sometimes be deep in thoughts and then distracted by some other thought over there. And again, that other thought over there is a bigger thought, so I'm not losing focus because of like scattered brain, but it's because I'm still, I think, trying to like solve for too many things. So I've turned up the dial of intensity of trying stuff. I'm not where I want to take it to. But this is starting to, again, like have that re-engagement with what I view as my healthy self, but what at least some psychiatrists might say is someone that you want to be watching out for. And that's why I want to start at least logging through talk therapy some of the things that I'm feeling about. My creativity's coming back. My higher verbal, written, and other ideas are coming back. I think they're all sane. I can't alone be the judge of that. I hope they're entertaining sometimes. I mean, I think if anything, for those who sometimes not just want to talk into the void, but find something from the void, if there's anything here that helps in your own situation, speak to something you're dealing with, I think that would be great. That's the experiment for this month that's going alongside turning back on puzzles. I've got trips planned, like through the sabbatical, I've had the goal to like try to read a book every week and have someone recommend me books every other week. And in honest practice, I have not read, what would that be, 24 books? I've not read 24 books so far this year. But I'm trying to get some new stuff done, and I'm engaged. It's been really fun and fascinating to connect with people I haven't connected with before. I'm trying to have even new conversations with strangers, but they're people who I want to be talking with. And so one who's in the artificial general intelligence is their goal kind of realm is someone I've been kind of the most open with and talked about the weird things like how I can be playing a game like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, get that right, and see like I measured my mental health through how I played that game. And to not spoil things, like it feels like a game where there's just a huge task list, and so it mostly hit my OCD tendencies and you can get things done. But like the approach of getting the Korok from here to there was never building a thing. It was just trying to like carry it slowly. Like so, I wanted to get the task done. I was not engaging in creative mode with getting things done, and so as a sign, like I wasn't 2 months ago or whenever the game was out, I think it was in May. Like I wasn't fully like where I wanted to be. And like that game's never going to be great for me because it's a resource management game. I don't like sort of using things in these games as a whole. Like I always worry I won't have it in the future. That's one of my weaknesses, is like holding back too much. But anyway, like I've talked with others. I now want to just stage some recorded conversations to this wall, Dr. S. Maybe the next ones won't feel as scripted. Maybe the next ones will just be me talking and then I bring the visuals later, but they'll be just as honest and just as like actually not scripted. And it's a little playful, but like in the 90s, there was an AI called Dr. Sbaitso. You could just write basic things to it and it'd say basic things back. I have no idea who's listening to this. I for sure know that eventually some of these things may be scraped into the systems that are trying to kind of make broader intelligence, but like both humans and anything else needs better tools to deal with the promise and limitations of our intelligence. A very human limitation of my intelligence is when I turn it on the most, I'm at the risk of mental illness. Probably schizophrenia, certainly paranoia. I've had paranoia. I don't think I've had schizophrenic traits. Again, I can't be my own doctor, but Some days that's like the best doctor I have is myself. And so this is for me, but it's for anyone else or anything else important that might be out there listening. Yeah, I put a meme at the start searching for Tommy Snyder. Like it's for giggles. But I live my life 100% serious and 50% joking. And if you're confused by that, it's because the axes are different. And I know we're at time, but we'll have another session when I feel it's right to schedule it.